The Rhine was not just a river. It was a line carved by nature and fortified by centuries of fear. To Germany, it was the guardian of its heartland, the barrier that had saved empires and humbled invaders since Roman legions first tested its currents. Every schoolchild had grown up hearing that no foreign army could cross it under fire and live. Even in 1945, after cities had fallen and armies had shattered, that belief still clung to German soldiers like religion. From the air, reconnaissance photos showed the Rhine as a dark, coiling serpent stretching from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea. Its surface glittered coldly beneath winter sunlight, masking treacherous undertows. On its western bank, the remains of once prosperous towns smoldered in ruins. On the eastern, German machine guns crouched in concrete nests, waiting for shapes to appear through the mist. To the men watching through binoculars, the river was hope itself, a last natural wall to slow the relentless American advance. They believed the water would buy them time. They believed wrong. In the bitter early months of 1945, the Allied push had become a machine of exhaustion and inevitability. Every dawn brought the same rhythm: mud, smoke, progress. Convoys rolled east across a landscape beaten flat by years of shellfire. Villages that had existed for 8 centuries were reduced to stone dust. Each mile gained cost blood, but each mile brought the Americans closer to the beating industrial heart of the Reich. Then the Rhine loomed before them, swollen by spring melt, roaring and wide, colder than steel. Here the momentum stalled. Tanks idled, trucks lined up in silence, and soldiers stared across at a river that seemed almost alive. The Germans, retreating in grim discipline, had blown every bridge, leaving twisted carcasses of iron that jutted from the current like broken bones. To cross meant madness. Commanders called it a natural fortress, and even the most daring planners knew an assault would drown thousands. Yet somewhere far from the front, in a quiet General Motors warehouse stacked with steel hulls and half-finished engines, waited a secret born not of glory but of necessity, an invention that would make the impossible routine. The Germans had long admired American speed and scale. They had watched factories rise faster than they could be bombed, seen bombers appear through fog thick with contrails, and witnessed shells fall by the ton from skies that never slept. But they could not imagine that American engineers would turn even a truck into a weapon of water, because this one could swim. They called it the DUKW, letters that stood for nothing poetic, just a factory code. D for 1942 design, U for amphibious utility, K for all-wheel drive, W for 2 powered rear axles. Yet the men who built it smiled at the coincidence. Duck, 6 wheels, a steel hull, a propeller that folded down like a secret, a vehicle that could crawl from sand into surf and back again without hesitation. To German eyes, it would have looked absurd, almost comic. A lumbering toy half-boat, half-truck. But in war, absurdity often hides genius. The story of that genius began not on a battlefield, but in a room that smelled of oil and salt air. In 1942, as America fought on 2 oceans, a small circle of engineers faced a problem that no textbook had solved. Could the backbone of logistics, the truck, be taught to float? Could an army move across rivers without waiting for pontoon bridges, without slowing the tide? The idea seemed fanciful, even childish. They built prototypes that sank almost instantly. The next batch leaked so fiercely that crews had to bail with buckets. Each failure was logged, analyzed, and built upon. Rod Stevens, Jr., a yacht designer from Sparkman, and Stevens brought a sailor's stubborn faith in balance and buoyancy. He reshaped the bow into a curve that could split surf, lined the seams with rubber gaskets, and tested again. Slowly, the impossible began to behave. When the prototype finally skimmed across a harbor, without drowning, the engineers cheered, but the Army did not. To generals, the notion of a floating truck sounded like a waste of steel. Until nature itself delivered the demonstration they couldn't ignore. That autumn, a hurricane slammed into Cape Cod. Roads vanished, bridges collapsed, and entire neighborhoods were trapped by floodwaters. Conventional rescue boats couldn't reach them. A handful of DUKWs were dispatched. They plowed through debris, rolled across submerged streets, and hauled families from rooftops. By morning, headlines called them the trucks that saved a town. The next day, the Army's skepticism evaporated. By mid-1943, factories from Detroit to St. Louis were stamping out DUKWs by the thousands. They were not elegant, but they were miraculous. Each carried its own heartbeat, an engine that drove both wheels and propeller, a bilge pump that spat defiance at leaks, a steering system that worked on road and river alike. 2.5 tons of supplies could be delivered directly from a ship's hold onto a beach without a single dock. What once required hours of unloading now took minutes. When the first convoys landed in Sicily, German observers assumed they were seeing landing craft. Then the boats rolled up the beach, shifted gears, and drove inland. Soldiers stared as the water dripped from their fenders. By Normandy, entire shorelines pulsed with DUKWs, green shapes crawling from surf like mechanical reptiles, their tires leaving serpentine trails in wet sand. To the men unloading shells and bandages, they were lifelines. To the enemy, they were nightmares that ignored geography. Each DUKW was a bridge unto itself, and every bridge meant one less delay, one less opportunity for the enemy to regroup. But in 1945 came the final test. The Rhine, the river that once stopped Caesar, waited. The German army had turned its eastern bank into a fortress of guns and concrete. Every bridge across the river, confusion turned to disbelief. German field officers raised binoculars again and again. Certain fatigue had blurred their vision. The shapes on the opposite bank were moving strangely, too smoothly for trucks, too low for boats. Then the truth dawned with a chill. The vehicles were floating. Not barges, not ferries, trucks. 6-wheeled, steel-bodied monsters crawling across the current like creatures of myth. For a heartbeat, no one fired. Machine gunners stared, mouths half open, as engines roared through water that should have swallowed them whole. One officer barked, "Feuer!" and the hillside erupted. But the round splashed uselessly short. The strange craft kept coming, their propellers biting through the current, their drivers hunched forward behind glass streaked with spray. To the Germans, it felt like watching logic collapse. Everything they had learned about warfare, about bridges, fortifications, and choke points, was unraveling before their eyes. The Rhine, their last defense, was no longer a barrier. It was a stage. For the Americans steering those amphibious beasts, fear had no time to exist. The river tugged at the hulls like a living thing. Smoke drifted low and artillery flashed along the horizon. Yet inside each cab there was only the drone of the engine and the pulse of concentration. A DUKW driver once wrote home, "It felt like driving across the moon, half land, half dream." They knew one wrong angle, one snapped propeller, and the current would flip them like toys. But there was a strange calm in that danger. The line of trucks moved as if guided by a single will, part human, part machine. High Command would later call it a bridge made of motion. Hour after hour, the amphibious convoys churned through the river, each truck following the wake of the one ahead. Ammunition, rations, radio sets, even field hospitals crossed this living conveyor belt of steel and determination. The genius of the DUKW was not simply that it floated. It functioned without pause. It could drive from a depot straight into the river, climb out on the far side, and roll directly toward the front line. Engineers no longer needed days to build pontoon bridges. The bridge was already alive, breathing diesel and courage. Logistics, once the dull, invisible art of moving boxes, had become a weapon sharper than any blade. In an age where armies lived or died by their supply lines, the DUKW turned transport into attack. That was the American gift, to turn practicality into power. Across the Rhine, the German command spiraled into disbelief. Reports arrived in broken phrases over crackling radios. Enemy vehicles in the water. Repeat, vehicles are swimming. Impossible. Verify. At first, senior engineers dismissed it as hysteria. Perhaps these were landing craft left from Normandy, they argued. But when binoculars revealed rubber tires spinning above white foam, the truth hit with the weight of inevitability. America had redefined what a vehicle was. Artillery officers scrambled to adjust range tables. Shells shrieked over the river, throwing fountains of water into the air. But the DUKWs were small, fast, and in constant motion. The explosions landed behind them, bursting harmlessly in the wakes. The amphibious trucks advanced as though guided by destiny. A German corporal later scribbled in his pocket diary, "We had built walls against men." We never imagined we needed walls against their machines. Behind this spectacle stood an empire unseen, the vast American war industry. From Detroit's assembly lines to Pittsburgh's foundries, 1,000 factories beat in unison. The DUKW was only one offspring of that rhythm. Each bolt, each weld, each rivet carried the fingerprint of a worker who would never see a battlefield. They labored under fluorescent light, not sunlight, yet their endurance shaped the outcome of continents. Every DUKW on the Rhine was more than steel. It was the echo of a nation's collective will. While one army marched on rationed fuel and desperation, another marched on abundance. The Germans had once prided themselves on craftsmanship, on tanks that were masterpieces of engineering, on guns that could pierce armor at a mile. But each weapon was precious, irreplaceable. A Tiger tank might take weeks to build. A DUKW could be produced by the dozens every day. In modern war, quantity had a quality of its own. As the hours passed, American officers marveled at the efficiency unfolding before them. Convoys entered the river, delivered men and materiel, then returned for more, never breaking rhythm. To an observer on the ridge, it looked less like battle and more like industry. War reduced to process, precision, and pulse. By dusk, the sun had become a red smear across the western sky. The first wave of DUKWs, now empty, drifted back across the Rhine, their hulls glistening with bullet scars and river mud. Behind them came engineers with pontoon sections, latching the pieces together to form permanent bridges. What the DUKWs had proven, the engineers would make eternal. In a single day, the Americans achieved what German high command believed would take weeks. Night fell, and the roar of engines gave way to the groan of armor. Tanks rolled across the new crossings. Infantry followed with rifles slung over shoulders. Fires burned along the horizon where artillery shells had found their mark. The myth of the impregnable Rhine line dissolved into smoke. In nearby villages, civilians peered from shattered windows, watching the glowing arcs of tracer fire reflected on the water. Someone whispered, "Even the river has surrendered." Yet what made the DUKW unforgettable was not its steel nor its speed. It was what it symbolized: adaptability. When the world demanded boats, America built trucks that could swim. When the enemy built walls, America built wheels that ignored them. Where others saw limits, America saw design problems waiting to be solved. The DUKW became the emblem of a new kind of warfare, a war of imagination, where inventors mattered as much as generals and draftsmen wielded as much power as divisions. By March 1945, more than 22,000 DUKWs had been produced. They had crossed not only the Rhine, but the Seine, the Loire, and the Elbe. They had carried bridges, bullets, and bread. They had ferried the wounded, the weary, and the hopeful. German prisoners captured after the crossing struggled to describe what they had seen. Again and again, their testimonies repeated the same phrase: trucks on water. It sounded like madness. It looked like the future. Behind those words lies the essence of 20th century warfare. Not who had the strongest army, but who could imagine faster. The DUKW was not born from genius alone. It was born from the refusal to accept barriers. It showed that invention could outrun ideology, that motion could defeat monuments, and on the Rhine, that lesson was written in ripples of diesel and courage. When dawn broke the next day, the Rhine no longer looked like a river. It had turned into an assembly line, an artery of motion, humming with engines and willpower. From one fog-covered bank to the other, DUKWs moved in endless loops, steady, deliberate, mechanical, carrying life through the wreckage of war. The crossing that was once estimated to take weeks had been conquered in mere hours. The German defense did not crumble because of one decisive explosion or one heroic charge. It collapsed because of something quieter, a shift in imagination. The Germans had built walls and waited behind them. The Americans had built machines that ignored walls altogether. They had learned that dominance didn't lie in holding ground, but in moving across it faster than fear could follow. As the fog thickened along the river's surface, a German captain watched through his field glasses. What he saw defied language. Vehicles gliding through smoke as if the land itself had liquefied. He lowered his scope, rubbed his eyes, and murmured to his men, "They have turned the earth itself into a machine." To the Americans inside those trucks, there was no sense of glory, only rhythm. Water slapped against hulls, engines coughed and growled, exhaust mixed with the metallic scent of cordite. Men who had grown up on farms and city streets now felt the strange sway of current beneath their wheels. They were soldiers, yes, but for that moment they were sailors, sailors of steel. Each crossing blurred the boundaries between elements, land and water, man and mechanism, fear and focus. Inside the DUKWs, conversations were brief, functional, coordinates, headings, loads. No one spoke of courage. In that silence, courage became ordinary. When one DUKW was struck midstream and began to sink, its crew didn't scream or wave. They radioed a single word: mark. Nearby drivers adjusted course by instinct, noting the swirl of debris and continuing forward. Momentum mattered more than grief. The mission wasn't conquest. It was connection. Connection was victory. By the final week of March 1945, the Allied front had become liquid, an organism of motion that could not be cornered. Supplies flowed through once impassable rivers as naturally as blood through veins. The Rhine, once Germany's sacred shield, had become the artery of its defeat. Here, amid the churn of diesel and spray, America's real strength revealed itself, not in the flash of firepower, but in the quiet mathematics of logistics. For every gun that fired, a factory had forged its barrel. For every meal eaten at the front, a warehouse worker had packed a crate. For every DUKW that floated, 10 unseen hands had riveted its skin. War, for the Americans, had become an equation. Steel plus imagination equals inevitability. And the DUKW was the perfect proof of that formula. Humble, efficient, and tireless. When Eisenhower's staff reviewed the Rhine crossing, they didn't praise luck or divine intervention. They praised design. They praised foresight. They praised the invisible army that existed thousands of miles away. The machinists in Cleveland, the welders in Pittsburgh, the women on night shifts who tightened bolts until their fingers bled. Those workers never saw the Rhine. They never heard the shell fire, never felt the cold river wind. Yet their fingerprints existed in every gear that turned, in every ripple that spread from a DUKW's hull. It was the anonymous triumph of the industrial age, an age where blueprints could win battles, and where every assembly line was a front line of its own. The Germans had believed rivers could save them. But rivers cannot defend against imagination. The Rhine could not stop an army that thought like engineers and moved like a current of industry. It could not comprehend an enemy that turned science into momentum, and momentum into destiny. When the last bridgehead was secured, when the tanks thundered east toward the heart of the Reich, the DUKW faded quietly from headlines. No parades, no speeches. It returned to its original calling, hauling, carrying, rescuing. It had no need for glory. It had already proven its worth. Its purpose was never victory. Its purpose was motion. In the aftermath of the war, thousands of DUKWs were sold or scrapped, their steel repurposed into peacetime machines. Some were used by fire brigades to fight floods, others by explorers charting coastlines. A few found their way into amusement parks, painted bright yellow and green, ferrying tourists who laughed as the boats rolled down ramps into calm lakes. Children clapped, unaware that beneath the cheerful paint lay the ghost of the Rhine. Each engine carried echoes, the deep hum of 1945, the roar of determination, the whisper of men who once drove through death to deliver life. In every splash of water there lingered the faint memory of shells, smoke, and courage unspoken. The DUKW didn't merely help end a war. It redefined what war meant. It proved that power wasn't measured only by destruction, but by adaptation. That victory could come not from stronger weapons, but from better thinking. It showed that the mightiest weapon wasn't always the gun or the bomb. Sometimes it was a simple idea, drawn on paper, built in steel and set afloat by faith. An idea carried by men who refused to stop moving forward. And that is what the German soldiers across the Rhine never understood, until it was too late. They weren't fighting an army. They were fighting possibility itself.